March 12th, 2010. New Britain, Connecticut. Two-century-old rivals sign paperwork combining Stanley Works and Black Decker into a single company, together valued at $8.4 billion. It is called a merger, but it is not one. Stanley controls the board, the strategy, and every acquisition that follows. Over the next decade, the same company quietly absorbs DeWalt, Irwin, Lenox, Craftsman, Cub Cadet, Troy-Bilt, Kwikset and Price Pfister. Garages, farms, and hardware stores filled with logos that still look independent, but they are not. One name sits behind almost all of them, buying reputation instead of building it. One familiar brand name at a time. If hidden ownership like this catches your attention, subscribe, because this channel exists to pull back the curtain on the companies, factories, and brand names that quietly built the tools sitting in your garage right now. To understand how one Connecticut company ended up owning half the hardware aisle, you have to go back to a moment when it owned nothing at all. In 1843, a young man named Frederick T. Stanley opened a small shop in New Britain, Connecticut, making bolts and door hardware. He was not chasing an empire, but something far more modest, a way to make a living selling hinges and latches to builders who had no good way to buy them. That sounds like a small problem today, but in the 1840s, it was a real one. If a builder needed a door hinge, he went to a local blacksmith, and the quality of that hinge depended entirely on the skill and mood of the man who forged it that day. One hinge might swing true for 20 years. The next, made by the same hands the following week, might bind, sag, or crack within a season. There was no standard, no guarantee, and no way to know what you were getting until you had already paid for it and hung it on a door. Frederick Stanley did not set out to reinvent hardware. He set out to make it predictable. A hinge from his shop was built to work the same way every time, using the same tolerances, the same materials, the same process. That consistency was the entire idea. It sounds unremarkable now, in a world full of standardized parts. But in the middle of the 19th century, it was close to radical. Stanley was not selling a better hinge. He was selling the promise that this hinge would be exactly like the last one. That promise ran straight into a wall almost immediately. Builders were used to walking into a local blacksmith's shop, handling the metal, and negotiating face-to-face with someone they had known for years, buying hardware from a small factory instead, sight unseen, shipped in from a supplier they had never met, felt like a risk nobody was asking them to take. Early sales were slow. Trust, it turned out, was not something a young manufacturer could simply announce. It had to be earned piece by piece, hinge by hinge, door by door. The reversal that saved Stanley's business was not a new invention. It was a decision to compete on something almost nobody else in the trade was offering: uniformity. Every hinge, every bolt, every piece of hardware that left his shop was built to the same specification, so that a builder in one town could trust a Stanley hinge exactly as much as a builder 2 counties away. Over time, that consistency did something no single sale could do. It removed the need for the buyer to inspect the product in person at all. The risk that used to sit entirely on the customer's shoulders, the risk of getting a bad piece of metal from a stranger, shifted onto the manufacturer instead. Stanley was betting that if he never let a customer down, the customer would eventually stop checking. That bet is worth remembering, because it becomes the measuring stick this entire story keeps returning to. Nearly 2 centuries later, when this same company starts buying up other people's brand names instead of building its own, the question every time is the same one Frederick Stanley answered in his own workshop. Does the new owner protect the trust a name took decades to earn, or does it simply borrow that trust and spend it down? New Britain itself was not an accidental backdrop for any of this. By the mid-1800s, the town had earned the nickname Hardware City, a dense cluster of metalworking shops, foundries, and skilled tradesmen packed into a few square miles. Stanley was not even the only name being built there. P. and F. Corbin was forging its own reputation in locks just a few streets away, and Landers, Frary, and Clark was doing the same with household hardware and appliances. By the later decades of the 19th century, New Britain was home to dozens of metalworking firms competing for the same pool of skilled labor, which meant a company could only get ahead by offering something the shop next door could not. That concentration of labor and expertise let a business like Stanley's scale precision, manufacturing in a way an isolated shop in a farm town never could. Skilled workers moved between shops, techniques spread quickly, and the raw materials needed to make consistent, reliable hardware were close at hand. In the early 1850s, the business was formally incorporated as the Stanley Works, and it began expanding beyond hinges and bolts into planes, rules, and tape measures, tools that depended even more heavily on precise, repeatable manufacturing. A carpenter's plane that was slightly off would ruin every board it touched. A measuring rule that was inconsistent from one unit to the next was worse than useless, because it would fail silently, producing errors the carpenter would not discover until the pieces no longer fit together. New Britain's growing rail and manufacturing corridor let Stanley move raw materials in and finish tools out efficiently, allowing the company to outscale small local competitors who were still working piece by piece, with none of that infrastructure behind them. The clearest proof of what Stanley had built came not in an advertisement, but in a demonstration. Picture a trade fair or a building site sometime in these early decades. 2 rules or tape measures laid side by side, one from Stanley, one from a smaller rival shop. A builder runs his hand along both. The rival's rule has a slight warp, a spot where the markings do not quite line up the way they should after months of use. Stanley's does not. It reads the same at one end as it does at the other, exactly as it did the day it left the factory. The builder does not need a sales pitch after that. He has felt the difference between a promise and a guarantee, and he walks away having chosen the company that could prove its claim in his own hands, rather than simply state it. That single idea that a company could earn a level of trust so complete customers stopped needing to check is what turned a small hardware shop into a foundation stable enough to survive war, depression, and generational change. It is also eventually what made the Stanley name valuable enough for later leadership to realize something the founder never intended. If trust like that could be built once, inside one factory, it could also be purchased from other companies who had already built it themselves. By the middle of the 20th century, the trust Frederick Stanley had built was no longer just a local reputation. It was a national one, and it had made Stanley Works one of the most recognizable names in hardware and tools in the country. But the pattern that would define the company's next 100 years did not start inside Stanley's own factories. It started with a rival, and with a brand that wouldn't belong to Stanley for another 50 years. In 1960, a company called Black Decker acquired DeWalt, a respected maker of radial arm saws known among professional carpenters and woodworkers for precision and durability. Black Decker, by contrast, had built its own name mostly among homeowners, known for household drills and consumer-grade tools sold through hardware stores and mail-order catalogs, rather than through the job sites and union halls where professional tradespeople actually made their purchasing decisions. That gap mattered. On paper, the deal looked like a straightforward business transaction, one company adding a well-regarded product line to its catalog. But look closer, and it reveals something more significant. Black & Decker was not simply buying machinery or patents. It was buying access to a class of customer, the working carpenter and contractor, that its own brand had never fully earned on its own. DeWalt did not need to prove itself to carpenters anymore, and Black & Decker did not need to spend the decades it would have taken to build that same credibility from scratch. It just needed to own the name that had already done the work for them. This is the moment worth pausing on, because it is the first clear preview of the exact pattern Stanley itself would run decades later. At a much larger scale, a company realizes that building trust from nothing, the way Frederick Stanley had to in 1843, takes generations. Buying a name that already carries that trust takes a signature. Stanley Works, meanwhile, was still operating largely as it always had, expanding its own product lines under its own name and competing directly with companies like Black & Decker rather than absorbing them. But this same instinct that would come to define Stanley decades later was already alive on the other side of that rivalry. In 1989, Black & Decker acquired the Emhart Corporation, a sprawling industrial conglomerate with roots going back to the United Shoe Machinery Corporation, and by the 1980s its businesses stretched well beyond hardware into fastening systems, glass container machinery, and electronics used in industrial manufacturing. Black & Decker did not keep most of that. What it kept were the consumer-facing brand names sitting inside Emhart's much larger portfolio. Kwikset, a major name in residential locks and door hardware. Price Pfister, a well-established faucet and plumbing fixture brand, along with Molly anchors and POP rivets. True Temper, another well-known name inside that same Emhart deal, would be sold off again within the year, changing hands before it ever settled anywhere for long. Think about what that means in practical terms. A homeowner installing a Kwikset lock on a front door, a plumber fitting a Price Pfister faucet. None of them were thinking about Black & Decker when they made those choices. They were thinking about the individual reputations those brand names had built on their own, often over decades, sometimes under completely different ownership structures with no connection to New Britain, Connecticut at all. After 1989, all of it answered to Black & Decker, not Stanley. Not yet. That would only change 2 decades later, when Stanley absorbed Black & Decker whole, along with every brand Black & Decker had already gathered on its own. This is one of the first clear signs that the wider tool and hardware industry, not Stanley alone, was shifting from companies that built their reputations product by product into companies that consolidated other people's reputations instead. It is worth being precise about what changed and what did not. The Kwikset lock still worked the same way. The Price Pfister faucet still carried the same warranty terms customers expected. On the surface, Nothing about the buying experience looked different, but the decisions about where those product lines were headed, which factories stayed open, which suppliers got contracts, and how much investment each brand received going forward now ran through a boardroom the original customers of those brands had never dealt with before. That pattern accelerated dramatically in 2010 with the deal that opened this story. Stanley Works and Black & Decker combined into a single company, Stanley Black & Decker, a name that immediately suggested two equal partners joining forces. The public framing leaned hard into that idea, describing it as a merger of equals. Two century-old companies pooling their strength to compete more effectively in a global market. The structure of the deal told a different story. Stanley shareholders ended up controlling just over half of the combined company, and Stanley's own chief executive took the lead role running the newly combined organization. This was not two companies meeting in the middle. It was Stanley absorbing Black & Decker's entire portfolio, including the DeWalt brand that Black & Decker had folded in 50 years earlier, back in 1960, and the Kwikset and Price Pfister names Black & Decker had picked up through Emhart in 1989. That means the professional-grade DeWalt name, trusted by carpenters and contractors for its saws, and later its full line of power tools, had now passed through two separate acquisitions without a single day of independent public ownership standing behind it since 1960. Picture what sat on a single hardware store shelf after 2010. A DeWalt drill, a Stanley tape measure, a Black & Decker household tool, three names, three different logos, three sets of packaging designed to appeal to three different kinds of customers, from the weekend homeowner to the professional contractor. A shopper standing in that aisle had no reason to think those three products came from the same boardroom, the same financial reports, the same executive decisions about where factories would stay open and where investment would go. But they did, and they had in some cases for decades already. This is the mechanism worth understanding clearly before moving forward, because it repeats again and again through the rest of this story. Stanley was not primarily interested in manufacturing new products under its own name, the way Frederick Stanley's original shop had, but in acquiring names that already carried public trust, names that customers already reached for without hesitation, and folding the decisions behind those names into a single controlling structure. Each acquisition looked from the outside like business as usual, a well-known company adding another respected brand to its lineup. From the inside, it was something closer to a slow, methodical accumulation of nearly every trusted name a builder, a farmer, or a homeowner might reach for, one deal at a time, until the map of who actually owned what bore almost no resemblance to what the logos on the shelf suggested. The next decade brought the pattern to its sharpest point yet. In 2016 and 2017, Stanley Black & Decker acquired Irwin and Lenox from Newell Brands for roughly $1.95 billion. Irwin had built its name on hand tools, clamps, pliers, and vice grips trusted by mechanics and tradespeople who cared about a tool holding its edge and its grip through years of hard use. Lenox carried a similar weight in cutting tools, especially saw blades relied on by professionals who could not afford a blade that failed mid-cut. Neither brand had spent decades quietly building that reputation with Stanley in mind. They had built it independently, under different ownership, answering to different customers with different standards. After the deal closed, both brands were folded into Stanley Black and Decker's existing manufacturing and distribution network rather than continuing to operate as independent businesses making their own calls about suppliers, factories, and investment. Decisions that used to sit with Irwin's or Lenox's own management. Decisions about which plant got new equipment or which product line got expanded now moved into the same planning process used for every other brand Stanley already owned. Both answered to the same Connecticut boardroom that now oversaw Kwikset locks, DeWalt saws, and Craftsman's future, which was about to become part of the same story. That future arrived almost immediately. Sears, the retailer that had carried the Craftsman name for generations and turned it into one of the most trusted labels in American garages, was in serious financial trouble. In a deal completed around the same period, Stanley acquired the rights to the Craftsman name for approximately $900 million. Sears itself reportedly relied heavily on outside manufacturers to produce Craftsman-branded tools for decades, which suggests what Stanley actually acquired was less a network of factories and more the name, the warranty program, and the licensing rights built up around it. Think about what that brand had represented for most of the 20th century. A Craftsman wrench was not just a tool, it was a fixture of a certain kind of American workshop, passed between generations, backed by a lifetime warranty that had become part of the brand's identity itself. None of that history involved Stanley. Sears had built it, marketed it, and stood behind it for decades. Now the name itself, detached from the retailer that made it famous, belonged to the same company that already controlled DeWalt, Irwin, Lenox, and Kwikset. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it exposes something the earlier acquisitions only hinted at. A brand name can outlive the company that built it. Sears, the retailer, was struggling badly and would eventually collapse into bankruptcy. But Craftsman, the name, the reputation, the promise printed on decades of tool packaging, survived that collapse entirely intact simply by changing hands before the company that created it went under. The factories that built the original tools, the specific relationships Sears had with its manufacturers, none of that necessarily came along with the name. What Stanley bought was the trust itself, sitting apart from the organization that had earned it. The consolidation kept expanding outward from tools into machinery that worked the land rather than the workshop. MTD Holdings, founded in 1932 and headquartered in Valley City, Ohio, had spent most of its history as a privately held, family-run manufacturer, building its Cub Cadet and Troy-Bilt lines through its own factories and its own relationships with dealers, largely outside the reach of the acquisitions reshaping the rest of the hardware industry. That independence ended in stages. Stanley first took a minority stake in MTD, then, in late 2021, acquired the remaining stake in MTD Holdings and bought Excel Industries, a Heston, Kansas manufacturer with its own long independent history in turf equipment, bringing Cub Cadet, Troy-Bilt, Hustler, and Big Dog Mower under the same ownership structure as everything that came before. It would be a mistake, though, to describe Stanley as a company that only ever bought and never sold, because the record does not support that. In 2012, Stanley sold its hardware and home improvement group, including the Kwikset and Price Pfister brands that had entered the picture back in 1989 through Black & Decker's Emhart deal and arrived at Stanley only when the two companies merged in 2010 to Spectrum Brands. Those two names which had sat inside the combined company's portfolio for years, moved to an entirely different owner. In 2017, Stanley sold most of its mechanical security business to a company called Dormakaba. Both moves show a company actively trimming its holdings, not simply accumulating everything it touched and holding on forever. Stanley was not building an empire for its own sake. It was managing a portfolio, adding names it judged valuable enough to control, and shedding names it judged were worth more or less useful in someone else's hands. That distinction matters for understanding what this story is actually about. It is not a simple tale of one company swallowing every name in sight and never letting go. It is a story about a shift in what building a business even meant. Frederick Stanley, in 1843, built truss the only way available to him, one hinge at a time, over years, inside a single workshop in New Britain. The leadership running the company nearly 2 centuries later inherited a different set of tools entirely. They did not need to earn a reputation from nothing, when they could instead identify which existing reputations were valuable and simply buy them. So return to the question this story opened with. A shopper today picking up a Craftsman wrench, reaching for a DeWalt drill, clamping something down with an Irwin vice grip, or riding a Cub Cadet mower across a lawn, might reasonably assume each of those is a separate company with its own history, its own factories, its own leadership, answering only to that brand's customers. For most of them, that assumption is wrong. Central ownership sits behind nearly all of it, and has for years, hidden in plain sight behind logos that never changed enough to give the shift away. Stanley didn't disappear into some larger corporate structure, the way so many once independent American brands eventually did. It became the buyer instead. Every name in this story, DeWalt, Irwin, Lenox, Craftsman, Kwikset, Cub Cadet, Troy-Bilt, represents a reputation built by someone else under different ownership, answering to different customers before ending up on the same balance sheet. Some of those names were kept and strengthened. Some, like Kwikset and Price Pfister, were eventually sold off again to new owners. None of them were built inside Stanley's own walls the way that first hinge was back in 1843 in a small shop in a town known for nothing more than the metal its workers could shape with their own hands. Walk out to your own garage tonight and look at what is actually sitting on the shelf. A Craftsman ratchet, a DeWalt drill, an Irwin clamp, a Cub Cadet parked out front. Somewhere in that collection is almost certainly a name you did not know, traced back to the same Connecticut boardroom as 3 or 4 of the others sitting right next to it. Tell us which one caught you off guard, and if you have got a story of your own, a tool passed down, a brand you trusted, for reasons that had nothing to do with who actually owned it by the time it reached you, put it in the comments. This channel exists to keep tracing that thread, one name at a time, and the next one is already in the works.